Good morning. This is Judge Rusty Johnston down from Mobile, Alabama, and this is your gun show on 104.1 KSGF, Springfield's #1 news talk channel. Our call-in and text numbers are open now at 417-447-5743, and that's for a telephone call or a text question. And if you're outside of that area code number, you can use the 800-630-5743 number. I'll be sitting in the commander's seat here for the next hour for Matt Canovi, who is out doing something, I'm sure, to earn a little extra money. Now, we feel lucky that you've joined us here on our gun show, or your gun show, where we talk about pistols, revolvers, rifles, shotguns, ammunition, concealed carry, personal defense training, and attacks on our God-given right to defend ourselves and our families. So have that second cup of coffee, take that second shot of early times or whatever turns you on in the morning. And if you've got a firearms-related topic or you want to talk about some of the topics I do, namely best presidents, worst presidents, and among the worst is going to be Abe Lincoln. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Or the Fourth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals coming out and saying that AR-15s are not protected by the Second Amendment because they're weapons of war. We're going to talk about that a little bit. If you got anything you want to talk about, call in, text in with that number. Or if there's just something you wanted to ask a judge or a circuit judge, but they so intimidated you, you didn't want to ask it. But I always explained everything I was doing to everybody because it makes it more interesting. And I think y'all have the same level judgeship up here, circuit judge. That's the person who presides over anything from a capital murder case to a car accident where the value of damages is over $10,000. So general trial court. So if you got any questions about that, I can probably help you out on it. One thing we do want to talk about is we got our, and I'd done this for Matt, and I guess he hadn't put it up. We got a caller who gets a little, I won't say irate. He has a strong point of view about infringed. I'm what you call an originalist, and the founders thought that the Constitution needed to be interpreted according to the ordinary words and meaning, meaning of words and phrases at the time it was written, because words change over time. For instance, the word gay in 1800 meant happy, joyful. Well, it certainly, maybe it means that today to some people, but to the majority of us it means homosexual. Infringed did not mean what infringed means now. It doesn't matter what I think it means or anybody else think it means. How do we find that out? We look at the books, text, periodicals, the usage of the word infringed when the Second Amendment was written. And the word, and I've actually posted this on the Gun Show with Matt Canovi group on Facebook, the whole memo I've written. I pulled probably 6 or 8 periodicals and dictionaries, including legal dictionaries, as well as looked at the Heller Supreme Court case. The word infringed, a synonym with the word infringed is raped, destroyed, eliminated. We get the word infringed, our usage, from copyright infringement, which means that's almost like when you park just over the yellow line in a parking lot into somebody else's spaces. You're infringing on that other parking lot. You're not parking totally in it. That'd be destroying that other parking lot. So it meant something different than it means today. That's not my judgment. That's just the way it is. Why didn't we say this a year ago? Well, it's because I didn't spend probably 18 hours pulling old books. The Heller case has been there the whole time that anybody could have looked that up. So, like it or not, that's what it means. And the courts have never even ruled that you have a right to carry a gun outside of your home. Our states have said that, but I'm talking about the federal courts. That's why we've got a problem that came out of the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals out of a Maryland case, but that court is based in Richmond. And the name of the case, if you want to know, is, I guess it's pronounced Kolbe, Kolbe versus Hogan. But what they said was, Maryland passed a extremely obnoxious registration scheme on AR-15s and the like, where they actually call them assault weapons. We know that's a made-up term, but that's what they call them. And they also passed a ban on any magazines over 10 rounds. The Court of Appeals, ultimately, the full court, upheld that ban and said those were military weapons of war and that they were unusual weapons. And they're not unusual weapons because we've got 5 million of them out in the hands of ordinary Americans. The Heller case said that you could not ban any type of firearms that were in common usage or normal weapons. But you could ban uncommon weapons or weapons that were unusual. So I always thought, well, obviously 15-round magazines would never be banned because every police officer carries those. And that as long as you've got, if you had AR-15s plus AK-47s plus Mini-14s, et cetera, you've probably got 8 million of those guns. This court, applying the worst prejudices of MSNBC, writes this order, gets everything all confused, but it will stand. It's the highest court in that circuit, Maryland, Virginia, that corridor there. Doesn't affect us, but it still puts down on paper something ridiculous, something horrible. And I'll say what President Trump did, this so-called court, because it is absurd. And it goes back to what I've told y'all before. We're never going to win by out-appointing conservatives to the federal bench. Congress needs to do its duty and take away jurisdiction from the federal courts to even hear these kind of cases. We've been trying to out-appoint conservatives. We've been trying to win by out-appointing liberals with conservative appointees for 200 years. And it never works out that way. They either co-opt our appointees or our people just get Potomac fever or whatever it is, but we can't win that way. They don't need to be judging every aspect of our daily lives. They don't need to be involved on whether you can pray in schools or not, or whether children have to go to this school or that school. They need to get out of the state's business. States were supposed to be in charge of the liberties of the people, not the federal courts. But we're going to be stepping into a break, folks. Remember that number, 417-447-5743. The Gun Show with Matt Canovi. This is Judge Rusty Johnston. We'll be waiting for some calls. We'll be back after the break.
'Cause I'll be waiting at the door and watching for you when you step foot on my land. You have to climb out of my cold dead hands and roll me away, no hurts. Say if you're coming for my guns, come and get them, son. I'll give them to you bullets first.
Folks, this is Judge Rusty Johnston. I want to welcome you back to Your Gun Show on 104.1 KSG, Springfield's #1 news talk channel. Remember, our call-in or text-in numbers are 417-447-5743 or out of the area code 800-630-5743. Let me give you a quote here, and this just sums it up perfectly, especially where we are as the Trump administration approaches the, I think, 40-day mark. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have the have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. And that came from the American Crisis that Thomas Paine wrote shortly before Washington's troops crossed the Delaware, attacked Trenton, New Jersey, the Hessians, and turned the tide of the war. Let me throw this out, and then I want to answer a text. The historians always come out with the rankings of the best and worst presidents. Now, keep in mind the history profession's been taken over by Marxists since I got out of it years ago. So you can usually reverse what they say. So they did that this week because, this is our dual holiday. It's Washington and Lincoln. And here is their list of the best presidents. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Missouri's own Harry Truman, Thomas Jefferson, John F. Kennedy. Here would be my list of the best presidents. James Monroe, who, by the way, won without opposition, and there was only one vote in the Electoral College against him, and that person just voted, may have voted for Washington just because they didn't want anyone else to win unanimously except Washington. So James Monroe, John Tyler, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Grover Cleveland, Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, James Buchanan, and Andrew Johnson. And the difference being is my list is presidents who obeyed the Constitution, honored their oath as president, didn't go out and do things they weren't allowed to do by law, and fulfilled their campaign promises. And I think that's a big difference. We had a question come in that basically asked, when is it illegal to advocate the overthrow of the United States government? And broadly speaking, that is called sedition, and that's been a crime in England and the U.S. off and on for a long time. Generally, in the United States, it's only been a crime during wartime. John Adams and his Federalist buddies made it a crime, the crime of sedition, to even criticize the president, skip vice president, any members of the cabinet or the government of the United States. Notice they skipped vice president because that was Thomas Jefferson. So if you call John Adams a little fat man, you were arrested and probably convicted. Hundreds were arrested. Now the standard is, by the way, when Jefferson became president, he pardoned everyone who had been convicted under that ridiculous act that was upheld by all the courts and refunded their fines with interest. Woodrow Wilson did the same thing, the Sedition Act of 1917 and 1920 during World War I. Anybody who criticized the World War I, our efforts in it, discouraged people enrolling for the draft. I mean, it was ridiculous. Thousands were arrested for that. I mean, that seems inconceivable today. But Warren Harding, who a lot of people regard as terrible, when he went in office, he commuted everybody's sentence who was still in jail and let him out. Now, what the law is now, those acts have been repealed, but remember the old saying, you can't shout fire in it's actually a theater, not crowded theater, a theater. Of course, you can if the theater's on fire. That's not the law anymore. The law is that under a case called, let me make sure, I think it's called Mapp versus Ohio, that you can say about anything you want regarding advocating violence against the government or anyone else, as long as your statement doesn't cause an imminent incitement of violence. In other words, there's the federal building. Let's all go burn it down right now. That would be illegal. But if you were speaking saying this government is so corrupt, John Locke said whenever a government becomes so tyrannical and so corrupt, it is not only our right but our duty to replace it. That wouldn't be illegal. And now, we don't even have a law on the books now, but that wouldn't be illegal. But if you gave such specific instructions that violence was going to result, and probably right then, that's illegal. So that's the difference. Now, all of our friends have gone to the Lincoln Day festivities. Now, this is not because I'm from the South, or maybe it is. I find it kind of incredible that a president who violated about every provision in the Constitution, who caused the death of well over 1 million people, would be a celebrated figure. He should have been tried for war crimes after the war, except he was dead. 1 million people come from 1 million troops killed during the war, North and South. They never count 750,000 slaves who died of various diseases because they were put in various camps. They had no place to live after the war. And then, of course, diseases swept through those camps. Now, critics would say, well, you awful people in the South were keeping slaves. We had to do this. This is the only nation in the world that fought a war over ending slavery. The amount of money that was spent during that war, every slave could have been purchased, and every slave could have been given 100 acres of land for what that war cost, and that's not counting the human lives. 1 out of every 4 military-age man in the South was killed. Lincoln didn't care anything about freeing slaves when the war started. He just didn't want slavery to extend to states that it wasn't in. That's reasonable. But to make him into a saint is really kind of hard to believe. And another thing, you can find plenty of writings on this. He was not a churchgoer. He certainly was not a Christian. He mocked regularly any preacher he went to that preacher's church. It is, I would say, it was the fraud of the century, if not every president we've had. He had, dozens of times he could have prevented the war from happening, yet he pushed forward. And I tell you, folks, y'all had it. There were several counties in Missouri that were burned to the ground because of Lincoln, his orders. The South did not actually become rebuilt until after World War II, almost 100 years later. That was a lot of destruction, and then to celebrate him is just amazing. But the other ones on the list, Franklin Roosevelt, to be on the list of the top 10 when he executive order rounded up Japanese Americans who were citizens of this country and had them put in concentration camps. By the way, our friends at the U.S. Supreme Court said that was perfectly fine, which it just shows you again, we need to get the Supreme Court back to what they ought to be doing, hearing cases involving robbery of U.S. banks and U.S. post offices. We're going to step into a break, folks. If you disagree, call in or text in, and we'll talk about it. This is Judge Rusty Johnston for Your Gun Show on KSGF, Springfield's #1 News Talk Channel.
Picked up his pen, and now it's written in the ink, y'all. It doesn't matter what you think, y'all. I've seen the writing on the wall, y'all. That's where the trouble begins. Oh, and it's a long way back to justice. It's a long way back to right. They're gonna make me an outlaw before I die.
None of us are outlaws here on the Gun Show. This is Judge Rusty Johnston, who used to be a politician, so I tell you, and I'm glad I'm not anymore. One of the things that you need to think about is stop thinking in terms of the Second Amendment gives you the right to own a gun, or the Second Amendment really has much to do with the right to gun. It only protects or only stops the federal government, and now they've kind of perverted it to say the state governments, from interfering with your right to carry or own a gun. Your right to own a gun pre-existed the drafting, the ratification of the Constitution. It existed in one form or another, because use the word arms to be synonymous with firearms. Arms prior to that was a sword. Prior to that was, whatever. It has existed in one form or another back to Rome. And I'm going to give you a good quote on that, and that comes from the United States versus Cruikshank. I'll give you the citation. This occurred during Reconstruction down in Louisiana. And I usually don't like to quote the Supreme Court, but when they give us a good ruling, I don't mind doing it, because it's a ruling that makes sense overall, and it just tells you about this, where rights aren't given to us. They're there. They come to us from God. Most people believe in God. If you don't, they come to us from nature. And let's see. It says that, let's see, this is not a right granted by the Constitution, neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed. But this means not infringed by Congress. This is one of the amendments that has no other effect than to restrict powers of the national government, leaving the people to look for their protection against any violation by their fellow citizens. This right existed prior to the formation of the Constitution and has really nothing to do with the Constitution itself. Let's see. It has not been surrendered or restrained by the Constitution of the United States. That's what you call an inalienable right. Those inalienable rights were retained by the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution, which says, I'll put it in modern English, the fact that we've listed some of these rights in the Constitution, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., that doesn't mean those aren't all the rights that have been retained by this Constitution. There are lots of other ones that we haven't listed. And the fact we hadn't listed them out here doesn't mean you lose them. And what those were is the rights that free Englishmen had at the time of the ratification of the Bill of Rights. Then notice what I said, kind of like in Fringe. They were the rights free Englishmen had at the time of the ratification. Not now. That doesn't mean that you have the right to same-sex marriages. It means you had the right to travel freely, unmolested. You had the right to raise your children as you saw fit. Those are the rights of free Englishmen. And there are lots of them. You can look to Blackstone, and number one right in Blackstone is the right of a baby to be born. It says after it's viable. What does that mean? But back in 1780, it really meant when you could hear the heartbeat, the right of a baby to be born. That was an absolute right of an Englishman. That baby had a right to be born. Your right to your own reputation. That was one of the prime rights of a free Englishman. We don't consider that worth much now, but it was worth killing back then. People wonder, oh, well, why would you have a duel? Well, because your right to your reputation meant whether you could work or not. If someone had you labeled a thief or whatever. You couldn't work anymore. So I'll see if I get this transmitted. Drew's still there, I assume. So I guess nothing coming in on the board that we need to take care of. And Sarah, nothing that I need to answer before I launch into just because I'm talking a lot, folks, don't think your calls aren't welcome, all right?
Yeah, not at this time, Judge. However, I would like to say that Doug joined us on the Gun Show with Matt Canovi Facebook. We appreciate that, Doug. Other than that, I haven't had a lot of activity.
Did the post make it up about infringe?
What I've got is the last thing from you about 3 hours ago, wake up. It's almost time for the Gun Show with Matt Canovi.
Okay, it ought to be something just after that. Maybe you ought to refresh it because I put something.
There it is. There it is. Shall not be infringed.
Yeah, so anybody that, wants to look that up, and believe me, I won't say it was a revelation, but it was a voyage of discovery for me. And anybody can do this. The easiest way to do it, and I'll tell you, I didn't know about this till 6 months ago. You can go to something called, we all hate Google. They're really a part of this conspiracy that is battling Trump, but may as well use their products. They're free. Google, and then you put in the word N and GRAM, like Ngram, but all one word. It's a chart, and what it will do is you put a phrase in there, it will chart out all the times a particular word has been used. They have scanned in millions of English language books from 1700 to now, and you can I put in the phrase self-defense, but I've spelled defense with a C like the English do, DENFENCE, and it showed a graph over time how often that word was used. Well, then I picked a period of time, like around the signing of the Constitution, and I pulled books from that period of time, most of which are free for download on a PDF download, and I was just looking at how the word self-defense was used. And, hey, that it's really pretty neat to do that. There was no ability to do that 10 years ago. I mean, the researcher with more money than, God couldn't have done that. But now any of us can do that. And that's how you can get a real feeling of what was going on. And one of the most interesting one was I put in the phrase liberty. And liberty was at its highest about the time of the Revolutionary War and our Constitution. That phrase has been dropping in usage ever since, and now it's really at a low point. Now, that could be good because, what you have, you don't tend to worry about, but I would contend that our liberty is in grave danger right now. And we got a dumbed down population that doesn't realize it. But what is, we had, I think it was an ad for the station, maybe for the show, that said, tyrants always try to silence free speech first. I would contend that's incorrect. They seize arms first. General Gage didn't go after the shut down the newspapers first. He went out to Concord to grab the Minutemen's arms and ammunition. That's where he went. Once you get the arms and the ammunition, then you can shut the newspapers down. But you got to get the arms and the ammunition first. And that's what they all do. You can look at every kind of tyrant. They go after the arms and ammunition. Then they'll go shut the newspapers down. Of course, most of the time now, the newspapers are working for the tyrant, so who cares? But, by the way, our friend Lincoln shut down 300 newspapers in the North that disagreed with what his belief was. That sounds incredible now, but he did. But we've always got to guard against tyrants in whatever form. I would tell you, a lot of the stuff George Bush II did was outrageous, and he should have been called down for it. Trump's doing the right thing. Keep these terrorists out of the country and don't be invading our rights. Don't have people snooping to see what books we checked out from the library. Let's just keep the terrorists out of the country. I mean, that seems a lot simpler and a lot fairer for all of us. And we're going to step into a break, folks. If you have a question, text, get it into that number, and we'll talk about it. We got about 15 more minutes to go. And this is Your Gun Show with Rusty Johnston sitting in for Matt.
Back to the Gun Show with Matt Canovi on 104.1 KSGF, Springfield's News Talk FM.
Couple of things. We had a question about, do you have a list of best presidents? That has been just posted to the Gun Show with Matt Canovi. Now, that is my list, but it's also a list of several of my comrades who are like-minded. So that has just been posted. One caller wanted to know about, could you expand on suspension of habeas corpus? Yeah, I will briefly. There's a case, you can look it up, called Ex Parte Merryman, Merryman. The Constitution says very clearly, and it's in Article 1, that's dealing with powers of Congress, that the writ, it always says the privilege of habeas corpus, which I hate. But anyway, habeas corpus cannot be suspended. You can go to England, you can go to the United States. That is always the power of a legislative body, sure, the power of the Missouri legislature. Habeas corpus means, and I used to get them a lot as a judge, whether you're in a mental hospital or a jail out in the country, you can send a petition to a judge and say, I want a hearing as to why I'm being held. Is this lawful? Lincoln authorized his generals to suspend that writ of habeas corpus wherever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to. He did. So a man named Merryman was arrested in Maryland. He got a writ filed with the circuit judge. They handled the circuits, federal circuit judge, who happened to be Chief Justice Taney. Taney set a hearing. The commander of Fort McHenry, where the man was being held, refused to even show up. So Chief Justice Taney sent an order out there saying, a huge order, went through the history and all, and the U.S. Marshals who took the writ and the order weren't even permitted to come in, and basically Lincoln just gave the finger to the Chief Justice, and his apologists, Lincoln's apologists, later say, well, Congress later suspended the writ and gave him the power to do it. Well, that was later. That's after I rob a bank, and then 6 months later, the bank gives me a loan for the same amount I robbed it for. That doesn't make any difference. He did it. He's not authorized to do it, and it was done in Indiana, where a man named Milliken was almost hanged. He banished a former congressman named Clement Van Landingham, banished him to the South for just speaking out against the war. It is just replete with those type things. Then we had a question on protection of property. I want to give you a quote just to show you this isn't recent, but you cannot use deadly force to protect personal property is stuff you can carry around or drive in a car, TV, etc. Real property is a house and stuff affixed. Real property is land and stuff affixed to the land. If even in real property, if somebody just wanders in there and is of no threat to you, you can't use deadly force. They have to be a threat to you, a threat of serious physical injury or death. But you ask on personal property. If someone's stealing and they're no threat to you, you see them, they run away. I think it's like Matt's ad. He said you can't use deadly force against them. I frankly thought that was maybe some U.S. Supreme Court case from 30 years ago. So I went back and I found several law books from the 1700s from England. And, we just adopted the English law. And back from 1700, said the same thing. It said to chase a thief and to use force or deadly force upon a thief who was no longer a threat was not self-defense, but revenge. And if you reread the self-defense statute, you can use self-defense when they are an imminent threat or a threat of death or serious physical injury to you. Someone running away with your property is no longer a threat, serious physical injury to you or your loved ones. Now, if you try a citizen's arrest, which you're allowed to do, and they draw a weapon or attack you, that may very well be a different situation. But a person that has stolen is not. That's just how it is. Let's see. Obama, the last several weeks of his administration, had Social Security working on changing their regulations regarding Social Security disability. The bureaucrat, that's been stopped, but the bureaucrat said, hey, we were just doing as we were ordered to do. That had to do with anybody who was taking antidepressants, anybody who was diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, mental issues that did not bar you from owning or buying a gun under the law, but they were just invading your private records, and they were going to try to take all of those people that had validly gone to the either Social Security or veterans. Well, that's been stopped. But that's the kind of stuff he was doing the last days of his administration, which was really insidious. Let's see. Do you and other judges speak about as a judge? Do you I got a question. Do you or other judges speak about your thoughts about the Bill of Rights? I'm technically retired. They can always draft you into service if they need more judges, but when I was actively a judge, I often did what they call CLEs. I did more than anybody. I just think I did more than everybody put together. That's continuing legal education. But I'd go to real estate groups and all, and I spent way too much preparation time. But I would put on a legal education deal for them and go through the history of the ratification of the convention, why the anti-federalists demanded a Bill of Rights, the history of them, would do that. I thought that was part of my obligation as a judge because we're charged with educating the public, and so if the public is always invited as to the law, and so I didn't want to educate them as to what the speeding laws were or something like that. I couldn't keep up with all of that. I felt like that was my obligation to do that. Let's see if we have anything else we can get to in the last minute or two. Let's see. That might be it. I will post something real good. Oh, I understand that if Representative Long wants to, that Billy Long voted. I don't think this ever came up for a vote about the Social Security and the Obama's thing. This says he thinks he voted for it, but I don't think it even came up for a vote. Coming up to the end of the gun show, I want to personally thank all of our sponsors and everybody that made this possible. Had you all not put up the money, we wouldn't be on there. I want to thank our producer. I want to thank Stacy. I want to thank Dee. I want to thank everybody that had something to do with the show. And you can listen to this on replay, on podcast. It'll be available. I don't know if Sarah does that or not, but in a couple of hours. And I'll post something about ex parte Merriman on the guns on the website. This is Judge Rusty Johnston. Thank you for listening to The Gun Show with Matt Canovi. We'll talk to you next week.